Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Making Friends, a webinar for parents and caregivers. My name is Adriana Lombardo, and I am the Program Manager for Child, Youth, and Family Programming with AboutFace, and I've been with AboutFace for a little over a year. Before we begin, we'll start with a land acknowledgement. AboutFace is committed to inclusion and diversity. In keeping with Indigenous practices and building respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples of Canada, we want to recognize the traditional territories or ancestral lands of the Indigenous people. Since we are meeting virtually, I would like to recognize that the Indigenous people are the traditional keepers of the lands and waters where each of us is joining from. I also do this in the hopes that inspires you to learn more about the land and the people who took care of this land long before we got here. And if you would like to learn more about your land or the land that you're on, you can text the number on the screen, or you can also check out native-land.ca. If you've never been on a Zoom webinar before, I'll explain a couple of things. Only the panelists and hosts are visible on the screen. You, the participants, will not have video access, but can participate using the chat and Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A for all of your questions. The chat will be used for you to participate in the webinar. Questions may get lost in the chat, so we do highly encourage you to use the Q&A, and we'll keep an eye on that. There may be an option where participants can ask their questions live via voice at the end of the webinar. We will do our best to answer your questions as we go along. However, we may be limited with time. One last thing to note before we start, we cannot provide any specific advice or counseling. If you have any questions that may be considered this, we do highly recommend that you consider talking to your healthcare team. And now I'm going to introduce our two panelists today. We have Colleen Wheatley and Tiffany Lewis, who will introduce themselves and we'll begin the webinar.
All right, my name is Colleen Wheatley. I am a member of the facial difference community, and I am a staff member with AboutFace. I'm a social worker, and outside of my work with AboutFace, I work as a mental health clinician. So lots of these topics are things that I spend a lot of time talking about with community members, parents, and families like you.
Hi, I'm Tiffany Lewis. I am a parent of a cleft lip palate child. I also sit on the contingency board for AboutFace. I have for 7 years now. And I am also peer-to-peer. So yes, welcome.
Yes, and Tiffany is here to offer some of that insight as a parent and expert in that experience, which I'm very grateful for. So we're going to start talking about why are we talking about making friends? And in my experience, you know, I've been involved with the community, I'd say since I was born, and with the specifically AboutFace community for a couple decades. And this consistently comes up in conversations, you know, when I see questions is many families are concerned about social relationships. Will my child's facial difference impact their ability to make friends? And then I'd say the next big concern that comes up is, I don't want my child to experience any bullying. What can I do to avoid it, all of those things? And actually research shows that one of the most protective factors around bullying is one friend. Having one friend can actually greatly reduce the risk of experiencing it. Nothing is perfect, but I think kind of this is a way that we can be proactive in setting things up. And also, I mean, life is better with more friends, having more fun. It's also, I'd say in the AboutFace community, I know I find a great deal of support from my friends within the community, just in understanding that experience, having those conversations. And another reason we wanted to talk about it is sometimes, you know, there's like this illusion of common sense, you know, that making friends is easy. Everyone should just know how to do it. And the thing is, social skills are actually not organic. They don't just happen overnight. They take time, they take practice to develop, they take coaching. And, you know, I'd say, I know that working in education, that's definitely something that we've been seeing, you know, after experiencing the pandemic, right? Social skills have changed. I know I'm still kind of relearning and adjusting to what my social skills are in this kind of new normal and those things. So that's really important. So again, just kind of developing these skills and knowing that this can take work and that's okay. So in this presentation, essentially we are highlighting kind of a few different strategies to do this. And I would say like that support that caregivers can offer, real tangible examples, supervision, and then again, just practicing some of these skills. So we'll kind of be going back and referring to some of these pieces throughout the presentation. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that it's important to know that you don't have to be friends with everybody. We want to have good friends. We want to have positive friends. You'll see some of the information is based in research from the Peers project, and you can see there will be some acknowledgement of some of the research that has been done. But really, it's important to know that there are good choices and there are bad choices. I think a lot of times, you know, we think everyone should be friends, right? And we don't want to set children up for that expectation that they're going to be friends with every single child in that classroom, right? And it's going to happen automatically. And so we don't want them to expect that. And also, there are probably people in their class that they shouldn't be friends with, that are not positive friends, right? So I think really being honest about that, you know, as an adult, I've run into lots of people in my life. There are some people I like, but I'm not friends, you know, I haven't kept in contact with. So just kind of being acknowledged and letting kids know, because sometimes you know, as a kid, you think, well, everybody, like I should like everybody should like me. And that's the priority, which actually would create more risk. So I want to talk a little bit about, you know, when you think about, okay, like who do we want children to be friends with? And, you know, Tiffany, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on this, but like, what would an ideal friend be for your child? What are some of those pieces? Or it can also be some things that we would want to avoid.
You're definitely going to want to steer them towards children that are like-minded or show the same social activities. So one of my daughter's best friends enjoys playing soccer, and these girls have played soccer together since they were 7 and they're now 15. And even though they go to different high schools, they are still very much so intertwined with each other and consider each other's best friends. So it's nice to have that secondary support from someone that you've had longevity with, and that the tough conversations about your face, and those questions have already happened, so they don't need to happen again. And I think that's important for children, is to realize that that kind of friendship support is great.
Yeah, and I really appreciate the example you gave of too, is like having a really good friend who's not at the same school, right? Because I think, or even it's like, oh, but their best friend isn't in the same class. And so I think that's really a great example too. And acknowledging that maintaining those friendships can take work, right? I'd say as an adult, I am learning that all the time, right? If I don't put effort into maintaining contact with that friend, you know, there's some friends where like, yeah, we can run into each other in 10 years and everything's great, but like also it does take work. So I think it's important for kids to kind of learn some of those skills at a young age. Of course, I mean, there's a reason we're having this webinar. If it was so simple, then like, why would we need to have these conversations if all of these things happen automatically? And so talking a lot about kind of, there is risk in making friends. I think a lot of times, you know, this can be scary for parents, for caregivers, right? We want to protect adults. We want to protect kids from everything. We also, some of us, myself included, we have that really bad habit of we want to fix things, right? You know, I know myself the other day doing some observations, some kids playing Foursquare, and I was like, oh, they're fighting about someone's cheating. They don't know. I need to step in and fix it. When actually, like, no, I didn't. Like, stepping back, they figured it out. There was some yelling there, you know, but that's a skill, problem solving, figuring things out. And kids, you know, kind of need to go through those learning experiences. You know, I think it's also, sometimes we might have expectations, right? You know, how many adults kind of want, well, I want my best friend's child to be my child's best friend, right? Which sometimes it does work out well, but also they might have completely different interests in all of those pieces. And really, we don't want to teach children that you need to force those friendships. you know, that you need to be uncomfortable, that friendship should be uncomfortable and challenging. I mean, yes, there are challenges, but we want to teach them that they're fun and they're enjoyable and you deserve, and like your interests are valid. I think another thing, and we will find in this presentation, is it's not a linear journey. This presentation is not a perfect flow because there are things that go back and forth. There'll be good days, there'll be bad days. And a big challenge is we can't predict everything, right? I've had a lot of families ask this question. Well, what school should I go? Should my child go to a private school? Should they go to a public school with more diversity? Like, what's the right answer? And unfortunately, there's not a clear right answer. So, you know, if you were looking for that perfect answer, you might not get it. We might have some tips and queries and suggestions, but there's not. We can't predict how other peers will respond to children all the time. And we can't always even predict how children we know very well will respond every time. So that can be very, very challenging. There's no perfect thing that will protect a child from ever experiencing bullying. There isn't. So it's all about what can we do to build kind of tools and protection around that versus then kind of a perfect cure. Those rarely exist for anything else as well. And I think acknowledging that part of learning friendships too is there will be hurt feelings, right? This will happen, and it can be so hard. I have found with a lot of families that I have worked with, it can be very challenging because when families are so protective, right? Parents don't want to talk about bullying or facial differences with their child because they don't want to upset them, right? But then what happens is then when we talk to that child and they go, well, I didn't want to bring it up with mom and dad because I wasn't sure if it would upset them. So it's everybody's trying to protect each other, but it's really not actually, the protection is kind of hindering the support, right? And so it can be hard. It can be hard to see your child upset or fighting with a friend, but also if you don't know how to resolve a disagreement with a friend, that's going to be very hard later on. I mean, at least I don't always get my way, which is good. I shouldn't always get my way. I need to learn, right? So sometimes it is going through those ups and downs and kind of acknowledging that sometimes things are hard and that's okay. And then when there are successes and good moments, we can celebrate those. I talked about supervision. And this again, also research has shown that this is a protective factor when it comes to bullying. So there are a few kind of different examples here. I'm sure other folks can think of their own examples. I know for me personally, my parents were very intentional. I did not realize this until later on in life, but very intentional about hosting playdates. So back in the day, like I would have to ask to use the landline at home and then call another friend's landline to set those up. And my parents would host, whether it was kind of in a park nearby, but so that they would be able to kind of see, okay, what's going on with this friendship, just so then they could feel better and more confident, which will be helpful if we're dropping off children and we're tense and anxious about that play date, they're going to feel that energy and that dysregulation, and they're going to be more anxious about that play date too. So things that make you feel more comfortable and confident too are actually really helpful. You know, and when I talk about supervision, I mean, it doesn't need to be, you know, like through a one-way mirror or anything like that. It can be kind of just checking in. So even if your child's not at home, it can be checking in with a phone. I know one parent who told me like they would use texting to check in how things were going at the dentist, right? And so they could be in the same room and the child would like text to be like, I don't know why this dentist just said this to me, or like really it was more likely an emoji, like, oh my gosh, right? So there are lots of different ways of checking in, and it's practicing that communication with your child. It can be thumbs up, thumbs down, just like, how is your play date on a scale of 0 to 10? You know, and 10 being the most amazing time ever, 0 being like, no, I never want to go back You know, what was it? Okay, it was a 7 out of 10. That's really great. Like what made it better than a 6? Right? Or if it's lower, like, oh, why wasn't it quite an 8? Right? Kind of having these tools to have those questions. I've had it described by a parent in the community, and they explained it as scaffolding parenting. And I really love that analogy because it was explained as kind of scaffolding along the side of the building. It's not stagnant. It's not permanent. It's flexible, and it can be taken down, but it can also be built right back up. And so that's kind of the way I see the supervision, right? You know, you can start with it, you can ease off. And it's interesting when I think about this as like a platonic friendship, it's like, okay, how do we do it? Whereas I'm sure if I ask parents, well, how do you supervise a romantic relationship? There might be a few more quicker answers, right? How we can do that, you know, the door open policies, kind of all of those different things. So it's about adapting and also communicating with your child. And it can also be, are there different places, those organized social activities, right? So it doesn't always have to be you. It can be those after school clubs. It can be like scouts, kind of all of those pieces where children are learning these social skills, but there's support, right? There's someone leading maybe that first introduction of, you know, today, Adriana was like, here, I'm going to let people introduce themselves. So there is a little bit of that facilitating. So that's where there's that supervision and support as well. So there's lots of different ways to do that. And again, this kind of leads into where it's all about practicing these skills. So again, and it does seem, well, practice making friends, but really, truly, it is about practicing making friends. Personally, when I was a teenager, I was very nervous. I knew that from where I lived, I knew I was going to have to move to attend post-secondary education. And that was something that made me really nervous. You know, I had an older sister at home. I was from a small town. I knew most people. I knew people around me. And the reality is too, I'm from a small town. I still will run into people. You know, when you have a significant birthmark at that school, people tend to know. So I often am approached by parents who are like, oh, you went to school with my child. And I'm like, oh, I might not remember, but they remember me, which I'll take as some flattery. I'm okay with it. People also remember my dad because he's tall, right? But I was nervous. So what I would do is I did go to overnight camp. It was scary. I was nervous. And I did get homesick. I worked at camps too. And I found those were because other people in those places needed to make friends too. Right. And even as an adult, I'm kind of aware of that, right? When I'm settled, I'm like, oh, I don't need to make new friends. But if I'm moving to, you know, camps or conferences or all of those things, those are other people who don't have that support network. So that can make it easier to make those friends. So that was something I know I did quite intentionally. And it was really helpful. It meant that as an adult, when I moved to a new community, I learned it takes me 3 months to make friends, like real friends. And so then it meant when I was at the 3-month mark, still feeling kind of lonely and, you know, maybe having a homesick cry on Sunday, I was like, oh, that's okay. I'm right on schedule. This is okay. Things that you can practice it is that role playing, right? You know, especially with younger little ones and toddlers, it is that practicing, taking turns playing with a toy. How do you ask for a toy? What do you do when somebody else takes the toy and you don't want it? I know when I would run playgroups for younger kids, you could always tell which kids had other siblings, right? And which didn't, because the ones who didn't thought that toy would be there where they left it. And then the ones with siblings would like, oh, I don't want to play with this toy, but I'm going to keep it right beside me so I know if somebody else is going to grab it. So it can be practicing. And again, engaging, playing with siblings in the family, different family members too. And it can be that part of stepping back, right? Of, you know, well, I want to watch this movie. Well, I want to watch this movie. Often adults will step in, right? We'll figure it out. But letting kids figure that out on their own. A lot of times with AboutFace Camp Trailblazer programs, we do talk about introducing ourselves, right? Practicing introducing ourselves, making eye contact. I think there's a great show, Reservation Dogs, and there's a character who will always, like, whoever they meet, he says, my name's Cheese, my pronouns are he, him, right? So he has practiced that skill of introducing himself and including his pronouns. And it gets easier. However you do it, it gets easier over time. And then that means if I go somewhere and I don't know people, I know that, oh, actually, I do have the ability to approach someone and introduce myself, right? Sometimes as an adult, I still need those pep talks as well. And I think, you know, like all of these things are okay. Different settings, you know, there's virtual settings, there's in-person, practice those approaching peers, right? You know, at the beach, something like, oh, can I help you build your sandcastle? And again, what's scary about this is we don't know whether that other kid's going to say, sure, come on over, or say, no, this is mine, right? So again, we know that there's risk, but then again, it's practicing that resilience. So when your kid's disappointed, if the answer is no, you can support that, right? Okay, well, how do we feel? What do? We move on, we build our own sandcastle, we go find someone else, right? And so again, these skills, so even if it doesn't go perfectly, that's actually helpful because we're building those skills, we're practicing these things. And I think even, you know, think about siblings. Siblings aren't going to, we don't expect siblings to get along perfectly all of the time, right? So those are skills, learning how to repair those relationships. Again, this is where some of that scaffolding, sometimes the parent needs to help out, needs to help navigate that. And sometimes it's also, you know what, you can figure this out on your own, right? And you know, maybe you try that and it's like, oh, actually I need to put that scaffolding back. We're not at this level, right? It's a little 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Maybe it seems the other way, but it's still practicing as well. Just one thing I do want to comment when we do talk about friendships and you know, a lot of what we're talking about is being proactive around the possibility of experiencing bullying. And I do want to acknowledge that sometimes those things can happen within the family as well. We always assume that like there's constant safety. So just acknowledging that those things can happen at home as well. Again, this is where we want to talk about what do we look for in friends, you know, and Tiffany talked about this. Well, you know, someone who like has common interests, that makes it a lot easier to find activities to do, who has some compassion, who cares, right? And so a lot of this it's kind of finding out, and this is where like, it's not linear, right? It's kind of also finding out, okay, well, who am I? What do I like doing? How do I find people who have similar interests? And what can I do? So a little bit, sometimes it's about learning about ourselves first before we take that next step. Next, this is just like a list that some youth have made up about kind of different groups. So, and the reality is we do look around, you know, something that often comes up in the facial difference community is we do make assumptions based on people's appearances, right? Like that's just a reality. That's something that's a safety thing. That's a social construction. We've learned that. So we do often make assumptions. Oh, well, like, you know, someone's wearing a sports jersey. Oh, they probably like that sport, right? Someone's wearing a band shirt. Well, they probably like music, right? So there are kind of all of these different groups. And also, I'm sure if we looked at this with kids, you know, you can check off, you know, if you're into sports, that doesn't mean you can't be into drama. That doesn't mean you can't be into music. So sometimes it's also going through and figuring out what are all of our different interests and kind of breaking down and being intentional. Okay, how does this turn into meeting people and making friends? So this is where it is finding different things. Okay, you know, you like music. Okay, is there, you know, like, that's a big thing I find working with kids, right? If you find someone else who likes the same band, oh, great. I don't even need to be there for that conversation, right? And it could even go both ways. If you find like Taylor Swift, you find someone who loves Taylor Swift, oh, they can talk about it forever. You find someone who doesn't love Taylor Swift, they can also probably talk about that for a little bit. So sometimes it can kind of work both ways. And it's figuring out, okay, well, how can this give more opportunities to meet new people and being intentional? And also acknowledging like it can be scary, you know, talking about video games, computer games. Okay, so, you know, is it connecting with other people online? How do we do that safely, right? Is it that, you know, like maybe someone else also plays and you join in so you can kind of pay attention to any of those conversations, is that some people might not be ready for that step. So sometimes some kids I work with, it's playing separate video games beside each other first. It's that parallel play, right? So they might not be ready. They might need that practice. Okay, and then, you know, a little bit of like, oh, what are you playing? What are you doing? And it can take time. You know, extroverts and introverts are going to experience these things differently, right? And so also I think that's one thing, is recognizing that not everybody's going to respond to friends and want to do the same activities, right? Not everybody wants to talk through every movie. So maybe I shouldn't go to the movies with those people. Or maybe that's what I need to recognize. Okay, this is a quiet movie. They don't need to hear my joke, even though it's super funny. And so it is, again, that communication and all of these things. So it's almost like there can be a few different steps in kind of expanding or finding those new friends, especially like, let's say you're moving to a new school, a new area. Okay, kind of how do I find my people, right? So there's just a few different examples: joining clubs, sometimes it's starting clubs. Sometimes it's also, I know when I work in camp areas too, it's who else has the anime shirt, right? Who else watches that show? So clothing can be, you know, buttons, pins, kind of different ways you can see, right? And you can kind of communicate, oh, okay, like, where'd you get that button? Oh, I like that show too, right? All of these things. And it can be, you know what, just start. This is where like the practice can come in. So, you know, like what happens if you see someone, I'm being very Toronto centric, but like you see someone wearing a Toronto's Maple Leaf shirt, right? You can just practice saying like, oh, I like that player. Kind of, or did you see the game last night? And you can just practice making one comment to one person, or just saying, hey, I like your jersey. That's it, right? And so it can be, and so then it can be when your kid comes home, hey, like, how'd it go? Did you compliment one person, right? And these things do take practice. So sometimes it's breaking them down versus, you know, there's other people, like my dad could walk into a room and start talking with anyone, no problem, right? But sometimes it's breaking down, so it's a little more tangible and giving those examples and those coaching. Okay, it didn't go great. Okay, what can we do differently, right? What could we do? What could we try again? That's okay. And this is where we're kind of going, weaving through this non-linear journey. And again, it's about finding friends that fit your needs versus, you know, parents generally, you know, we'd be concerned if our child is changing to fit in somewhere else, right? That's concerning. I appreciate your nods, Tiffany. But where it's like, oh, you're wearing your hair differently. Why are you doing that? What's going on? And so, but really sometimes it is creating that sense of self. And creating, you know, like we even talked about some of those positive affirmations. So I will be referring to, there is a resource created by AboutFace on building self-esteem. And so some of these notes are also on that resource, which is available on our website. So please feel free to go there for more information, and it is in the chat right now. So again, practicing these positive affirmations, right? And it can sound and feel a little silly, but it's like everything else. The more we practice saying, I am brave, reminding myself I am loved. Positive psychology research actually shows that practicing that means that we are more likely to look and identify those moments when we are brave, when we feel loved, all of those pieces. I am good enough and I'm fine with just being. And I mean, you know, I think that photo, that looks like confidence to me from an event from AboutFace a couple of years ago. And again, this is the part where building that self-esteem, you know, good days and bad days. I know when I was younger, I thought, and especially with relation to my facial difference, I thought that I only had two choices. I either could be like loud and proud and super happy, or sad and depressed. And that really limited myself, because it meant if I had a bad day, I was like, oh no, who am I? What's going on? And again, this is where parents, that reminder, good days and bad days, that's okay. Sometimes, you know, if a child says, oh, well, like, I'm never going to make any friends, so-and-so, Susie doesn't like me anymore. I'm never going to have a best friend ever again. And often adults, we want to fix it. Oh, don't worry about it. You know what? When I was your age, I thought with my friend we made up, or we want to fix it, right? And the risk that comes with that is then that child learns, I can't say when things aren't good to my parent, right? So sometimes it is, yeah, it sounds like you've had a really hard day, and it can be, do you want to talk about it? They might not, but this way they know that you're there and you're available. And, you might have to offer 20 times before you're actually taken up on the offer, right? But really validating those things. Be aware of how we talk about ourselves, right? If I'm putting myself down, I think about body image, right? If I'm constantly putting down like, oh, my thighs, I wish they were smaller, I wish my belly was smaller, that's what everybody else around me is going to hear. That also goes for friends, right? I don't want to hang out with a friend who's constantly putting themselves down, because that might make me want to put myself down, and I don't want to do that, right? So this goes for parents, for adults, and kids, but I think it also goes for us and our friends. Get involved in those extracurricular activities. Finding ones, I know there are always so many different costs associated. So just finding whatever activities, or finding there's a picnic in the park, different things going on, there's lots of different opportunities, and practicing. I know I've gone to swimming lessons where I was like, oh, it was hard. Or once I started going to wrestling practices, because I thought maybe that was something I could do. And it was so scary. I didn't know anyone. I was intimidated. And so it was when I was in university, and I would talk to my friends in my dorm, saying, I'm not going to want to go next week, so you need to tell me I need to go, right? Find those positive friends. Tiffany talked about this again. Find those positive friends, right? Build each other up. And there is research that talks about those power poses that we just saw Taryn doing in the last slide, right? Again, it actually does. Our body responds to that pose and that feeling of confidence, and we learn to know what it feels like. So again, that is that positive practice and training, and treating ourselves with respect. We often talk about treating others, the golden rule, treat others the way we want to be treated. And sometimes we need reminders to keep ourselves that way, right? And sometimes it is having those questions. Well, what would your friend say to you? What would you do? All of those pieces. And these are also good ways to check in. Do some of that supervision about friendships with these conversations. Again, there's more information on the resource if you want some more details. And we talked about how do we have these conversations, these check-ins with kids. And I think, it's kind of having these conversations of, well, how do you know what a good friend is like? What would a good friend be like for you? Sometimes it's also what makes you a good friend. What do you bring to the table? Sometimes it can even be going through that. How would we know that, that a friend's not a good fit, right? And that can really lead into, well, a friend who's always teasing me, who's making fun of me, a friend who doesn't call me back, right? And sometimes when we know that, that means that we can recognize when things are going well, things are going poorly. I think these are also conversations to have about using humor. In one of the previous slides, we included practicing using humor, right? Which can be a helpful tool. And it's kind of, asking kids, well, what's the difference between laughing with someone and being laughed at, right? What's the difference? A lot of kids I work with, they don't know the difference, right? They struggle to make friends, but if a friend is telling them, leave me alone, well, hey, that person is still interacting with me, right? So we want to teach kids about positive interactions, and also to understand those negative interactions. You don't need to bother with them. You can go find someone else, all of those pieces, right? So sometimes it is, well, and also I know I've had to be reminded myself, I am a sarcastic person who I can take a little bit of teasing. I also, as a kid, I absolutely made it clear to my peers, I can take teasing. I think I was even you can make fun of my hair. My hair was often a mess. My hair, you can make fun of my clothes, but you can't make fun of my face, right? That was just that was off. But my parents and I had that conversation. I had to practice that conversation. And it is kind of finding those pieces. And I know I've had to check myself where, you know, oh, the joke that I made at my friends, are, you know, the joke that I made about my friend, they're not laughing with me. So I need to check myself. I need to understand what the difference is to also laugh at someone versus laugh with them as well. So sometimes it is practicing these, talking about these. Again, these are things that we can do role playing with these pieces. So again, just kind of, and it can even be sometimes like having these conversations, having these questions, right? You had a sleepover. How was it? How did it go? Fine. I don't know. It was good. So sometimes it's having those more concrete questions. What was the best part? What was the hardest part? Sometimes with kids, instead of saying, what was your hardest part? You know, maybe if we're preparing for a sleepover, I'd say, what do you think makes sleepover hard for other kids? It could be easier to answer those questions when it's not as personal. So it's just kind of in the same way, it's practicing. Guess what, parents and caregivers, you get to practice too. Sometimes we learn through mistakes. I'm super smart. I have made so many mistakes, and that's okay. So these are a lot of different strategies that we can use. Tiffany, do you have anything that you'd like to add on maybe some examples that you've used in your home with your family?
I just think it's really important that parents acknowledge the fact that they are base one, ground zero for how their children are going to respond when the comments are inappropriate or hurtful, and that you really put that communication out there with your child that, yes, there may be comments, yes, there may be looks and stares, snickerings. It doesn't mean that that makes you not a nice person, not a happy person, not a person deserving of love, not a person deserving of friendship. And just a week ago, my daughter just had a quite interesting conversation with me. So because she had a maskable facial difference, she got to go into grade 9 with a majority of the students at her new school not knowing what she actually looked like. And so grade 10, masks came off. And she actually said to me last week, you know what, Mom? Nobody of my new friend group has asked me anything this year about my face. So then we got to have the conversation. Well, how does that make you feel? How do you feel about that? And, you know, she said she was very happy. It was nice to not have to explain it. And then I asked her, well, how do you explain it? She said, I'm not going to tell you because that's something I tell my friends. And I said, that's okay. You're allowed to keep that between you and your friends. So, I mean, communication is definitely key for parents in any aspect of that. So that's just always my suggestion, communication.
I think that's great. And I can almost, as you were talking, I can picture too that it's that front loading, right? You know, okay, we're going, you know, starting a new dance class. And I just got flashbacks. I took dance. I was not good at it. Apparently my mom believed everybody else was a half, you know, where everybody else is just a half beat early. No. But it is kind of that practicing, like, oh, what do you know? You know, what can you do if you don't know anybody? Well, I can try introducing myself. Okay, so what would you say? Like Tiffany said, and I appreciate also, right? Sometimes it might be, I'm not having this conversation with you, Mom. I'm not sharing everything. That's something private. And sometimes, and you know, and respecting that, right? Because now your daughter knows, okay, I can set those boundaries with Mom too, right? And I know sometimes, you know, that could be hard for adults and probably a change too, if you've had this conversation before, but it can be that practicing and acknowledging that staring can happen. I think a common experience, which is very challenging to kind of solve or fix, is something called microaggressions. And it can kind of, you know, this can happen with peers where maybe like everybody else in the class is invited to the party except me, right? And this is where like, yeah, I can't, you know, my parents can't force another child to invite me to their party, right? And also, what's that going to do? Is that going to be a positive experience for me? Probably not. So it's kind of dealing with those. And I really appreciate what you said, Tiffany, about just having that conversation of how does that make you feel, right? It's, you know, that's an open-ended question. How does that make you feel? Okay, well, what can we do, right? What are some things? And sometimes it can be, yeah, that feels pretty bad, you know, and it's acknowledging those instead of jumping to fixing, and I mean, I'm, you know, I want to fix things too, right? So again, these things take practice for us as well. So these are just, hopefully these are some helpful, tangible things that families can use to talk about friendship, and maybe do some reflection on what do we look like? What do, you know, it is that thing, what makes me a good friend? What makes someone want to be a friend with me? And that makes it easier for me to discover, well, what am I looking for? What am I looking for in friendship? It's kind of interesting. I feel like it's almost easier to have these conversations when we think about romantic partners. People can, you know, people can check off a list of what they look for in a romantic partner. And so sometimes it's just applying those to platonic relationships as well. What do I bring to the table, and what do I want in return? Every relationship, there are theories like every relationship is an exchange, right? Giving time, giving laughter, kind of all of those things, and what are we getting in return? So really taking some time to reflect and again, practice building these skills, practice trying new things, and knowing that it's okay if it doesn't go perfectly at first. That's okay. Try again. And the bonus is we are building that resilience muscle. So when things aren't going perfectly, that's a reminder that it's like, oh, actually, this means that we're building those skills so that we'll be ready the next time. Really, this is just that reminder, be patient. These things take time. Have fun and keep learning through all of these. Parents sometimes, you know, are expected to know everything. It's okay if you don't. It's okay if you don't know everything. And also because that makes it okay for your child not to know all of the answers. So thank you all for making the time. And now we do have an opportunity for questions, comments, notes. We all have our own experiences and might be able to share something that someone else can learn. I know that's something I really value from my friendships in the facial difference community, is being able to learn from others. And also I feel like it's just that relief, right? And it sounds like Tiffany described that with your daughter too, the relief of like, I didn't have to explain, right? I didn't have to explain. I don't have to explain what it's like to have a facial difference with other folks. So I really appreciate the community and all of the experiences that we can share.
Thank you, Colleen and Tiffany, for all of your great insight for this webinar. We'd like to open it up to all the attendees. If you have any questions, if you'd like to put them into the chat or the Q&A, now is your opportunity to do so. We'll give you a few moments to do that. And just a reminder that the webinar was recorded, so it will be available at a later date up on our YouTube channel. Colleen and Tiffany, there are no questions further to the webinar. Thank you both for your great insight and for being here today to participate with the webinar. On behalf of AboutFace, to all the attendees, thank you for joining.
Thanks so much.